To figure out the actual height of the contestants, I'm using a three-pronged approach. I'm using our world in data. That I'll also factor in a malnutrition, which can severely stunt growth. And finally, an X factor for all of the supernatural shenanigans that we'll be deciding based off vibes. First up is Dan, who can use as an example for this approach. Being an average man born in the UK around the early 1910s makes him around 171 centimeters tall. Now, due to his parents' general neglectfulness, we can also assume that Dan was partially malnourished as a child. But this is where our X factor comes in. Both of his parents were Sylvian worshippers, and while we're not entirely sure how Sylvian magic works in the world of Fear and Hunger, as there isn't any real-world equivalent to Sylvian magic, I think it is generally safe to assume that being around someone who practices Sylvian magic extensively causes a little bit of that magic to rub off on yourself, i.e. standing next to someone who is an extensive Sylvian worshipper will heal you slightly. This key assumption is going to be very useful later, so just keep it in mind. Anyway, back to Dan. Due to his parents' affiliation, we can assume that a lot of that magic had slipped off onto him, and that the natural healing ability of that magic counteracts the damage done by malnutrition, leaving Dan at 171 centimeters or a mere 5'8". Next up, Isabella, who's a lot simpler. Since she doesn't really have an X factor, and she does have very decent nutrition, we can assume that she stands at 165 centimeters, or 5'4". Next up is Osa, and our first major roadblock, since Abyssinia doesn't really have a real-world equivalent, and the only hint we are given in figuring out where Abyssinia is that it's not Ethiopia. But not Ethiopia is such a general term that we can't really figure out where it is. So, based off nothing but vibes alone, I'm gonna go with Somalia, making Osa 171 centimeters tall. While yes, it is possible that he had used magic to make himself a little taller, I'm gonna assume that he doesn't know how to do that because his magic is strictly offensive. To account for the likely malnutrition Osa had to deal with as a child, I'm going to take off 10 centimeters, making Osa 161 centimeters tall, leaving him at 5'3". Next up is Olivia, who's 173 centimeters tall. It can be argued that her condition might have made her a bit shorter, but doing math makes my head hurt, so we're just gonna stick with the original number, making Olivia 5'8". After that is Karen, who I'm going to assume is also 5'8" due to their similar circumstances, both being from the Burman Empire and born around the same time period with similar levels of nutrition and lack of supernatural shenanigans. Next up is Marco, who would be around 166, but due to likely malnutrition, I'll put it to 160. Leaving Marco at 5'2". Next up is Levi, who should be around 173, but due to likely extensive malnutrition due to his poor treatment in the orphanage, I'll drop it to 160 as well, making Levi 5'2". After that is Marina, who is a full 173, and due to likely not being malnourished, and her very likely experience with healing magic in the Vatican, I'm going to add a little extra, making Marina 175 centimeters tall, making her 5'8". Next up is Samy, and the hardest to guess. For one, I wasn't able to find a determinate date of birth for her, which is used to figure out the height for a person at the time period. On top of that, even knowing the height would be practically useless due to the amount of shenanigans she would have gone through during her time in the Vatican. So I'm just going to throw all reason out of the window and assume that she is 5'10". based on vibes and vibes alone. After Samy is Tanaka, and similar to Samy, I wasn't able to find a determined date of birth, but unlike Samy, I don't have to deal with any magical shenanigans altering his height. So I'm going to assume that he stands at 5'5", once again based off of nothing but vibes and vibes alone. Next up is the most normal man alive, Heinrich, who stands at 5'7", or 171 centimeters. And finally is August, who doesn't have a determined date of birth on the wiki page, but I'm going to assume that he is 6 foot based off vibes and vibes alone once again. Anyways, that's it. That's the entire video. I hope you enjoyed me being absolutely horrendously incorrect about every single number I've given. But hey, at least you can give yourself a pat on the back for being taller than all of the contestants.